Alright, in this lecture, which is actually going to be broken up into two videos, we're looking at what is called the contingency argument for God's existence. And this argument's got some punch to it. It's pretty potent. Now, I'm breaking this up into two lectures, and I'm going to warn you from the outset that this is a technical argument. But if you're patient and bear with me, you should be able to understand all the premises, the motivations and reasons for each of the premises, and then be in a good position to assess it. It's like I said, it's going to take some patience to wade through it. One thing that I stress when I teach philosophy classes, especially to students that haven't taken philosophy classes before, is that we live in a soundbite culture. Politicians are expected to explain what they're going to do about really complex policy issues sometimes in 10-second sound clips, which is not enough time to really develop any case for a policy position. And it's because our culture is just, well, we've all been conditioned to think in sound bites. Well, I'm trying to undo some of that tendency in you intro to philosophy students. So an important part of that is learning how to kind of wade carefully through complex arguments. Now, when I say complex, that doesn't mean that you won't have a difficult time understanding individual premises or individual aspects of the argument. I think all of the different pieces should be fairly understandable. It's just when it's complex, it's a lot of pieces that are going to be put together. But you'll be able to see the whole and how it makes sense in virtue of gaining a good in-depth assessment of the individual parts. And then you also gain an appreciation for the individual parts when you see it in light of the whole. So bear with me, and we're going to wade through this together. Alright, so recall that the causal argument begins with an obviously true empirical premise about the universe, or about the existence of certain objects in it. And then it proceeds by way of a generally accepted principle to a conclusion about the existence of a particular kind of being. So again, it has an a posteriori, as we call it, premise. That's the empirical premise. That's generally obviously true. You start with premises that everyone would grant. We'll call these public premises, okay? And then you take this general principle, and then you reach a conclusion. With the causal argument, tried to motivate the claim that God exists based on this causal principle. And we looked at various versions of the causal principle. Okay, well, in a similar fashion, the contingency argument is going to attempt to show that there must exist a self-dependent being whose existence not only explains itself, its own existence, but it also explains why there is a universe. Now I hinted at this in the last lecture on the causal argument, where in many theories they have their primitives or their basic entities, and these aren't explained, but they explain other things. Well, this is similar. This self-dependent being isn't explained by something else. Instead, it's self-explanatory. But it also explains other stuff, such as why there is a universe. So this is what the contingency argument is. Say that 10 times in a row. This is what the contingency argument is going to attempt to demonstrate the existence of. So the contingency argument, like the causal argument then, is an argument for an ontological conclusion. Now also recall that ontology is a study of what exists. What is there? What kinds of beings are there? Well, this is an argument that's going to try to argue that there is a certain type of being that exists that is a lot like what we would call God. Even if you don't believe in God, you would probably say that, yeah, but if something existed that had these features, yeah, we'll call that God, sure. Alright, so we're going to shift the question from how did the universe come into being? So that's an explanation of a particular event. And we're going to broaden it, or we're going to shift focus to a different question. Why is there a universe at all? You know, the question.
Many millions of years ago, a race of hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings got so fed up with the constant bickering about the meaning of life that they commissioned two of their brightest and best to design and build a stupendous supercomputer to calculate the answer to life, the universe, and everything.
Oh, deep thought. We want you to tell us the answer.
The answer to what?
The answer to life, the universe, everything. We'd really like an answer. Something simple.
I have to think about that. Return to this place in exactly 7.5 million years.
Is it finished? Oh, no, there's more. There's more. They go back.
What, 7.5 million years later?
That's right. They do.
Deep thoughts. Do you have
An
a...
answer for you? Yes, but you're not going to like it.
It doesn't matter, we must know it.
All right. The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is... "42.
Okay, let's hope our answer to the question of the universe is more promising than the one that Deep Thought gave. So it's not just, 42. So let's motivate the argument then. Let's begin with a very important, mind-blowing fact. You ready? Okay. A bunch of stuff exists. Huh. Yeah. Well, to elaborate, the kinds of beings that come most quickly to mind, planets and stars, people, planets, and mountains, these are things that depend for their existence on the existence of other beings. There wouldn't be planets without the molecules that make them up, for example. Okay. Your existence as a living organism depends on the existence of carbon and other elements and atmosphere with oxygen, the sun, food, and water for nourishment, and so on. And all those things I just listed depend in turn on other beings for their existence as well. All right? So the stuff that you depend on in turn depends on stuff for its existence. Now, we're not just talking about a causal dependence. We're talking about this more of a logical type of dependence. So when we say that X depends on Y, we don't mean that Y caused X per se. Instead, X is depending on Y means that conditions like Y and Z and Q are enough to guarantee that there is such a thing as X. So it's like a sufficient condition. So we'll say this, and here's a technical term. We're finally going to come up with a definition for the key term in the actual contingency argument. That is, we're going to define contingency. So, a being that depends on other beings for its existence is what we'll call a contingent being. And you and I are both contingent beings. So, plants are contingent beings while they exist. If things were otherwise, for example, suppose that there was no sunlight or carbon or nitrogen, then there'd be no plant life. So, plants are contingent beings. They don't have to exist. We can contrast the idea of a contingent being, then, with that of a necessary being. And a necessary being does not depend on other beings for its existence. It is completely independent or self-sufficient. So, we are not necessary beings. You and I are not necessary beings. We are not completely independent or self-sufficient. We depend on lots of things for our existence. Alright, well, since beings of this sort do not depend on other beings for their existence, they would exist no matter how different the world was. So, philosophers say then they exist, these necessary beings, they exist in every possible world. Well, we need to get clear on what we mean by worlds. When we say a necessary being is a being that exists in every possible world. We'll get to that. So, let's talk about some examples of what would be a necessary being, though. Many philosophers say that numbers are necessary beings. So 39 exists in all possible worlds because it is independent of the many possible ways things could be. So necessary beings are like necessary truths. No matter what the universe is like, it's a necessary truth that 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 will always be 4. Even if in different worlds, okay? And similarly, necessary beings, and if numbers are necessary beings, and this would apply to them, they exist in all possible worlds. More relevant to the contingency argument, though, God is sometimes held by most theologians and philosophers to be a necessary being. That is, if God exists, God is a being that exists that depends on no other beings for his existence. Instead, God exists by virtue of the kind of being God is. It's in God's own nature that he exists. So God, if he exists, is a necessary being. He depends on no other being for his existence. Well, there's an important parallel between contingent and necessary propositions and contingent and necessary beings. And this should be review, at least the necessary and contingent propositions. So recall, propositions are the sorts of things that are either true or false. However, not all truths are of the same sort. Some propositions are true, but they could be false. For example, it is contingently true that the sky is blue. It could have been the case that the sky on Earth is, for example, red, like Mars. It is true that the sky is blue, but it doesn't have to be that way. So we'll call that a contingent truth. Some propositions are true and could not be false. So we'd say they are necessarily true. Again, the truths of mathematics are necessarily true. It is necessarily true that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Doesn't matter how many things you tweak in the universe, 2 plus 2 is still going to be 4. Some propositions are false, but could be true, and we'll call those contingently false propositions. For example, it is contingently false that unicorns don't exist, but it could be true that unicorns exist. Finally, some propositions are false and could not be true. Again, many false mathematical propositions are necessarily false. And again, an example would be 2 plus 2 equals 5. Alright, so philosophers have a procedure, a heuristic, a methodology, a set of tools that we use to determine when a proposition is necessarily or contingently true or false. And they invoke the notion of a world. Now, I'm going to explain what this means. It's not what you think it means. When we use the term world in determining necessity and contingency, we don't mean a planet. So, possible worlds, these terms that philosophers use when assessing modal claims, that is, claims about contingency and necessity, they're not the types of things you can take a spaceship to. You can't take a spaceship to a possible world, unlike a planet. Instead, the term world implies the entire universe or metaverse, if perhaps there are many universes that are somehow causally connected. So, further, though, by world, we don't just mean how the universe is at a particular time, but for all time. So, a world would be how the universe is if the universe is everything that exists for all of time. Okay? That would be a world. So, when considering whether a proposition is true, that is actually true, we look to our world as it actually is, the actual world. When asking if a proposition is possibly true, we look to a related notion, the notion of a possible world. Well, what's a possible world? Recall that the world, the actual world, not planet Earth, but the actual world is just everything that just so happens to exist. The universe and everything in it, and if there are other universes that exist, those as well. That's the actual world. Well, a possible world, let's contrast it. We'll understand it by contrasting it with the actual world again. So think of the actual world as a complete story that describes in minute detail every fact about the entire universe at all times. All states of every atom, every person, every star, and so on for all times. So it's a very, very long story. Well, let's say it's complete. It's a maximal story. And like I said, it's going to be a very long story. Think of it. Another way to think about it, though, is to think of it as a long list of propositions, claims that can be true or false. This would be the complete exhaustive list of every proposition that would be true of our world, of everything that exists. So there'd be no proposition missing. And every proposition would be either true or false, depending on how our world actually is. So a possible world is in like this list. It's a story. So when we talk about worlds, we're going to be talking about these mega lists of propositions, like the super list of propositions we call the actual world, which is a list of propositions that are true of everything that actually exists. Now I note, non-actual worlds are going to differ from the actual world in some important ways, and so their stories are going to be different. That's just to say that some propositions will be true, some propositions that are true in the actual world are going to be false on other lists, and vice versa. That's what we mean. Okay? So, for example, it is false in our world, but possibly true that George Washington used a lightsaber. Well, what does that mean? It means that it is false in the actual world that George Washington used a lightsaber. But there are other worlds, there are possible worlds in which it is true that George Washington did use a lightsaber. In other words, there are other lists of where the proposition George Washington used a lightsaber is true, which would have been really cool. All right, so then we need to place some restrictions, though, on our notion of a world as a list of propositions first, though. 2 restrictions. First, the list has to be complete, and I've mentioned this already. Every proposition is included, and it's true or false. So in this way, every fact and every falsehood about the universe in extreme detail is represented. Now, like I said, this is kind of a tool, a methodological tool. We're not saying that these lists, exist somewhere on some piece of paper that we could find, like in some cave somewhere. In fact, it would take a really sophisticated mind. So, supposing God existed, God being omniscient, which just means all-knowing, God would be powerful enough to do it. But we can kind of get at it too with our, feeble, finite minds. All right, a second restriction. The story told by the list has to be consistent. So there can't be any contradictions in it. So no proposition can both be true and false. We can't have, for example, the proposition, there are married bachelors on any list. Nor can we have the proposition, Bertrand Russell had 5 fingers on March 1st, 1903, and Bertrand Russell had 6 fingers on March 1st, 1903. Those would be contradictions. This would be a contradiction, and this would be a necessarily false truth. So that couldn't be true. All right. Well, so to summarize then, a possible world is a complete and consistent story or a list of propositions describing in minute detail a way in which a universe could be. The actual world, the world you and I live and breathe in, is one of infinitely many possible worlds. So think about it. There's an infinite number of ways the universe could be but is not. Just delete one atom from this universe and then we have another universe that's a little bit different. It's a different possible world then. Well, there's an infinite number of combinations. So then the actual world is the story that describes the way our universe actually is, as it is. All right, here's some review then. Well, let's apply this tool of possible worlds to what we've talked about, modality and propositions. So, a necessarily true proposition is a proposition that is true at the actual world and true in every possible world. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a necessarily true proposition. A necessarily false proposition is one that is false in the actual world and false in every possible world. 2 plus 2 equals 5 would be an example. A contingently true proposition is a proposition that is true in the actual world but false in some possible worlds. For example, the sky is blue. And finally, a contingently false proposition is a proposition that is false at the actual world but true at some possible world. For example, unicorns exist. Well, let's talk about necessary and contingent beings then, all right? Because they're going to have some striking similarities to necessary and contingent truths. So consider what it takes to explain why contingently true propositions are true. So suppose someone says, we'll call this claim C, it is snowing outside right now. Now, I'm recording this lecture in June, but if I had recorded that in January, it probably would have been true, because there was a lot of snow in the winter of 2014. This is a long winter. All right, well, what explanation might be offered for why claim C is true? Well, you could reply, there are certain atmospheric conditions have obtained. There's just enough moisture in the air, and the temperature is sufficiently cold to mention only a few of the conditions. So, claim C is true because something else is the case. But it doesn't have to be that way. So claim C isn't true by its own nature, but rather it depends for its truth on other things being true. For example, the temperature. It couldn't snow if it was a little bit warmer or whatever. Alright, well then here's the big point. Some propositions depend for their truth on something else's being the case. When we supply the reason for their being true, we must appeal to something other than that very truth itself. So we'll say that a proposition P is a contingent truth, just in case that reason for P's truth is found in something else. Alright? So it's snowing outside would be a contingent truth because the reason for that claim's being true is something else. Now consider what it takes to explain why necessarily true propositions are true. So suppose someone says, and we'll call this claim N, bachelors are unmarried. Well, what explanation might be offered for why N is true? Here's one explanation, but, well, that might explain why a particular individual bachelor is unmarried, like this guy, or that guy. But we're interested in why all bachelors are unmarried. And actually what I mean is we're interested in what makes, so the claim all bachelors are unmarried is really disguised conditional. It's got an as a logician we would translate it as if X is a bachelor, then X is unmarried. Okay? So we're interested in what makes this conditional. If X is a bachelor, then X is unmarried true. Alright? So that's not about some particular bachelor, that's about all bachelors. Well, in this case, bachelors are by definition unmarried. And so N's being true doesn't depend on anything else as being the case. It is true by its own nature. There's no other way things could be that would make a difference. It's just the meaning of the word bachelor makes it true that all bachelors are unmarried. Okay? So that truth doesn't depend on something else. Of course, the word bachelor, that label we use, that sound, okay, it's contingent truth that we use that to refer to the concept of bachelor. But we're not talking about the word, that spoken sound, or that string of letters. We're talking about what it refers to, the concept. And the concept of bachelor is such that it's got to be unmarried. Okay? So it's an important difference. Alright, we'll say then that a proposition P is a necessary truth just in case that reason for P's truth is found in itself, like the case of bachelors being unmarried. Now let's turn to contingent and necessary beings. Alright, well first, a contingent being can be understood thus. B is a contingently existing object if and only if B exists and B fails to exist at some possible world. So you and I are contingent beings. We exist in the actual world, but there are worlds in which we don't exist. Our parents could have never got together, or our grandparents, or whatever. But recall that we also said that these objects depend for their existence on something else. Their existence can only be accounted for by appealing to something else. So we'll say B is a contingent being if and only if the reason for B's existence is found in something else. Alright? And you and I, again, are contingent beings. I don't need to explain that. Necessary beings were also characterized in terms of their existing in every possible world, existing no matter what the world was otherwise like. So we'd say B is a necessarily existing object if and only if B exists and B exists at all possible worlds. Well, we understand necessary beings to exist at every possible world because of their existence is independent of the existence of anything else. The existence of such a being is accounted for by its own nature. It's self-dependent. So we'll say that B is a necessary being if and only if the reason for B's existence is found in itself. Alright? You and I, the reason for our existence is not found in ourselves. So we are not necessary beings. I know it might be a blow to some of your self-esteem, but that's true. Alright, well, we can now formulate a general principle based on the nature of necessary and contingent propositions in beings. So recall I said that the contingency argument, like the causal argument, will start with a basic empirical premise that is kind of indisputable, and then also argue from a kind of general principle. Well, the basic premise is that just, stuff exists and it's contingent. Now we're going to get to that general principle, and it's called PSR, or the principle of sufficient reason. So first, notice the twofold distinction between contingent and necessary truths and beings is exhaustive. So the twofold distinction between contingent necessary truths and beings is exhaustive. Every truth is either self-explanatory or explained by other facts. And every being either exists by its own nature, that is, it's self-dependent, or it depends for existence on something else. There's no third option, all right? Now, yeah, so there's no third category of truths or beings that's not contingent or necessary, all right? That's it. That exhausts it. All right, well, the implausibility of there being truths with no explanation or beings whose existence is without explanation recommends a very important principle that we'll call the principle of sufficient reason, PSR. It can be expressed thus. For any truth, the principle tells us there is some sufficient reason or explanation for its being true. Additionally, for any being, there is a sufficient reason or explanation for why it exists, something perhaps itself on which its existence depends. Now I note, in demanding a sufficient reason for some truth or the existence of some being, the principle demands a complete account. Okay? And we'll say an account is complete whenever its being true is enough to guarantee the truth or existence of what it explains. So for example, if one were to explain why it's snowing, saying that it's snowing because the temperature is below freezing would not be a complete explanation. That fact is not alone enough to guarantee that it will snow. We need many other facts about the atmosphere and water and so on to give a complete, sufficient account or reason for why it is snowing. So, we can summarize then. The principle of sufficient reason, PSR states, for every truth, there is some sufficient reason or a set of reasons for why it is true, and for every being, there is some reason for its existence, some being or beings on whose existence it depends. On to part 2.